The Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations and the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. The subcommittees are meeting today to hear testimony on Southern California oil leak, investigating the immediate effects on communities, businesses, and the environment. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairs and the ranking minority members or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, Representative Jacobs from California is authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. Welcome, Representative Jacobs. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, member submissions for the record, such as statements, may be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that, as always, members are responsible for their own microphones. Pursuant to the rules of the hosting venue and the latest guidance from the Office of the Attending Physician, anyone present in the room today must wear a mask covering their nose and mouth unless speaking. It is my hope that with everyone's cooperation, we can protect the safety of members, staff, and today's witnesses, as well as the families they return to at home, and of course, our community members. The committee has masks available for anyone who needs one. First, I want to thank the Irvine Ranch Water District for hosting this hearing today. Christine Compton, Paul Cook, and her colleagues have been incredibly helpful in this process of bringing this hearing here to Orange County. A few miles from where we are gathered, an oil leak off the coast of Southern California has dumped tens of thousands of gallons of oil into the ocean. This oil is so thick, it cannot be washed off with dishwashing detergent. Hundreds of yellow-vested volunteers have dotted our coasts in an attempt to prevent as much damage as possible to the pristine beaches that serve as the economic engine for our area. As of October 10, workers had recovered 250,000 pounds of oily debris and 14 barrels full of tar balls from the Orange County shorelines. That is a small fraction, though, of the oil that was released, most of which is being distributed in the ocean, making its way into the food chain or falling to the ocean floor. Some of that oil is now heading south, and we will not learn the long-term consequences on the environment for many years to come. The exact cause and circumstances surrounding the leak are still under investigation by various federal and state agencies, but I want to assure the public this committee will do oversight to make sure there is a full, fair, and complete investigation of the circumstances surrounding this leak. Early evidence points to one or more strikes from anchors in an area trafficked by cargo ships. We will wait for the agencies to complete their investigation before talking about accountability. But the first step toward accountability is to understand the damage. And that's why we are here today, to hear directly from the community about what happened. In May of this year, my subcommittee held a hearing about the outdated federal subsidies that oil and gas companies get, and we considered whether they were a good use of taxpayer money. It will not surprise many people to learn that these subsidies are, in fact, a waste of taxpayer dollars. And to add insult to injury, companies like Amplify Energy, which own the leaking pipeline, received $5.5 million in pandemic relief last year, only 1 year after they purchased massive stock buybacks to line the pockets of their shareholders. The witnesses here with us today will reveal a different kind of subsidy for oil and gas companies, an involuntary subsidy that occurs when the community bears the cost of oil drilling's pollution. When a locally owned business, like Mr. Breneman's, that has been in the family for 4 generations, loses tens of thousands of dollars because of the leak, that's his subsidy to oil and gas. When a hotel loses its bookings overnight, that's its subsidy for oil and gas. when the fragile, decades-long effort to recover a species under the Endangered Species Act is finally showing progress, but an oil spill puts it all at risk. That's a cost of oil and gas, too. These subsidies and so many others are the reasons that oil wells, like the ones behind this leak, are still active. Getting rid of the subsidies is the first step to get rid of the problem. I'm so grateful for the excellent work of Chairman Lowenthal, whose subcommittee has put forward a number of legislative solutions. And the Build Back Better budget will prohibit new oil and gas leases in federal waters off the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, as well as the eastern Gulf of Mexico. The Build Back Better budget would also address abandoned, aging oil and gas platforms and pipelines. It would give a fair return to taxpayers and stop subsidizing the industry by allowing them to pay low royalty rates on the oil they extract from our public lands. Before I came to Congress, I was a consumer protection attorney, and I saw many families angry with a financial system that was not built to support them. And that's why I want to touch on one more thing. Congress must reform a broken financial system to stop these industries from taking advantage of taxpayers. Oil and gas companies use shell corporations to get rid of their cleanup obligations, and they abuse the bankruptcy process. And I think we're going to hear more about that as the investigation unfolds. The common sense solutions put forth by the Natural Resources Committee will put us on the path to the energy of tomorrow, instead of wasting taxpayer dollars on a dying industry who time and time again has put profits over people and our planet. This will help us compete with other countries who are already ahead of us in energy transformation, and they will help us protect our own communities from the predictable and preventable devastation like the leak that we are here today to discuss. Now I would like to recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources, my colleague from California, Mr. Lowenthal, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you, Chair Porter. And good morning to everyone joining us in person and online. And I want to echo Congresswoman Porter's first thanks to the Irvine Ranch Water District for their generous hospitality and assistance with this morning's hearing. Today we're learning from the community about the effects of the oil leak or oil spill that occurred not far from our shores. The latest evidence collected by federal investigators suggests that the 41-year-old San Pedro pipeline may have been initially damaged by a ship's anchor a number of months ago. However, it only started gushing thousands of gallons of crude oil into the ocean a little over 2 weeks ago, following some event or some accident. While internal estimates of the oil spill were as high as 144,000 gallons last week, the Coast Guard has recently reduced their estimates to a much lesser amount, but still a significant amount. This is welcome relief for the additional wildlife and communities that may have suffered from the spill, because it was a tremendous and devastating effect. But it's little solace to the shop owners, to the vendors, to the fishing people, and to the other small businesses whose lives were upended in a matter of moments and who are still recovering today. Furthermore, the thousands of gallons of oil that leaked into the ocean, washed up onto beaches, and inundated coastal wetlands that have had and will continue to have damaging effects on the ecosystems we hold dear. Southern California's coastline and our surrounding environments are the lifeblood of our communities and our way of life. And any threat to these resources must be taken seriously and addressed swiftly. But as Chair Porter emphasized, the exact cause and the circumstances surrounding the leak are still under investigation, and it will take time and patience before we all have the facts that we deserve and that what we need. But one thing is sure, we will get to the bottom of the spill and hold the responsible parties, including Amplify Energy, accountable for their actions. The California Attorney General has announced that his office is investigating the spill and is coordinating with state, local, and federal authorities. As part of this process, Congress must hear firsthand from those most affected about what they have seen and what they have experienced. And that's what today is about, listening and learning. The witnesses this morning will detail the effects of the spill on their businesses and on the environment so we can chart a course forward that will prevent future spills from occurring. But this is not a novel threat to us. Time and again, Californians have suffered at the hands of offshore drilling. From Santa Barbara in 1969 to San Francisco Bay in 1988 to Refugio Beach in 2015 and now to Huntington Beach. Each of these disasters has had a different direct cause and a different set of circumstances, but each is because we have not broken our dependence on fossil fuels and we continue drilling off our shores. Preventing new offshore drilling is a crucial first step and one that we're actively working to ensure remains in the Build Back Better Act, working its way through Congress. But we also must work together to wind down the current productions and the mandates that companies, and we demand that companies decommission their platforms, their wells, and their pipelines and clean up the mess they have left behind. As our nation continues its transition to clean energy future, the threat to coastal communities and the American taxpayers from aging offshore oil and gas infrastructure will only continue to rise. Last week, my subcommittee held a hearing about the dangers associated with these abandoned structures, and we will continue to investigate the issue further. If we do not address the root causes of the oil spills, what happens over and over? We will simply be navigating from one tragedy to the next. And the pipeline spill off Huntington Beach was a tragedy, and we continue to see those consequences today. Thank you, Chair Porter, for your subcommittee leadership and working to hold the fossil fuel industry accountable for the damage they cause to our communities and the climate. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and I yield back.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. Now I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, for his opening remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Porter and Chair Lowenthal, for your exceptional leadership and for holding today's hearing here in Orange County. I am very pleased to be able to join all of you and to hear from our witnesses and all the community members here as well. Thank you for taking time to participate on a Monday morning. We need to hear from you in this room, those that have been impacted by this spill. The environmental and economic impacts are profound. And the policy fixes that we have before us, those are difficult too. But working together, we can get it done. As my colleagues highlighted, today we continue the process of getting to the bottom of what happened and specifically how it impacted our local community. But there are several aspects of this that are still unfolding and are particularly troubling to me as somebody who grew up along the Southern California coast and went to the beach as a child. Seeing the entirety of the Orange County coastline fouled by oil is pretty stunning. We know that this spill was not reported by the responsible oil company until the next day, despite the company's knowledge. We also know that Orange County residents recognized that there was a problem, in part due to the smell caused by the spill, and actually reported it before the oil company did so. Clearly something wrong with that. This failure to report is completely unacceptable, but it's not particularly surprising. Because again and again, we've seen fossil fuel companies put their own bottom lines above the interests of our communities. And in this case, Amplify Energy's effort to preserve profits came at the expense of our beaches, our coastal economy, and our environment. In my congressional district, which is just to the south of here, the spill shut down businesses and beaches in Dana Point and San Clemente. Tar balls that are likely caused by the spill have also been found as far south in my district as Oceanside, Carlsbad, Encinitas, and Del Mar in San Diego County. I've heard directly from small business owners in Dana Point Harbor who suffered economically as the harbor was closed and business came to a standstill. It'll come as no surprise that more than $2 billion in wages and $4 billion in gross domestic product are generated by Orange County's ocean and marine economy, including tourism. So we have a lot to lose every time there's a spill, not just to our beaches, but to our economy. I'm pleased that all levels of government have worked together to implement a strong response to this spill. Led by the Coast Guard, the Unified Command has been aggressive and communicative as it organizes the cleanup and works with elected officials and the public. I've had the privilege of spending a significant amount of time with our leaders who are operating the Unified Command, and I've flown out over the spill site now on multiple occasions. But responding to this spill is not enough. We as members of Congress have a responsibility to our constituents and a responsibility to every one of you attending today to work towards policies that will put the well-being of our communities, our economy, and our environment above the profits of out-of-state fossil fuel companies. I'm proud that the House Natural Resources Committee is leading the effort to make that a reality. Last week, Chair Lowenthal's subcommittee held a hearing about the need for stronger federal oversight of offshore oil and gas infrastructure. We also passed 2 bills out of the committee that would strengthen inspection, leak detection technology, and reporting requirements for offshore drilling infrastructure. I'm confident that House leadership will bring these bills to the floor soon for a vote. And while these bills would enact good policies, they are not nearly enough. In fact, the inspection requirements and leak detection technology envisioned under this legislation is already being used in California. So the message is clear. Even with the more stringent procedures we envision, we will still face the all too real potential of further environmental and economic disaster from oil spills. So there are 2 steps that we need to take to ensure this doesn't happen again, and both are common sense. First, end new offshore drilling along our California coast once and for all. I'm pleased to share that a key piece of the President's infrastructure plan, known as the Build Back Better Act, would invest in the long-term protection of our coastal communities by doing just that. There is strong support in the House of Representatives for keeping this provision, it's on page 984, as it moves through the legislative process. After the spill, Chair Lowenthal and I led nearly 80 of our colleagues in sending a letter to the House leadership in support of the provision. So that's first, end the new drilling. But it's not enough, which is why we need the second step, end the threat posed by existing drilling off of California, because as long as dangerous oil and gas infrastructure is here, it will threaten our marine and coastal economy, and that economy is worth billions of dollars. We're already seeing the fossil fuel industry mobilize against these critical policies. Fossil fuel companies that profit from drilling activities will say just about anything to protect their bottom line, and politicians who benefit from fossil fuel industry contributions will gladly follow along. They will take great pains to distort the facts and mislead the public about the respective risks and benefits. Sadly, we've seen this deception before. Today, we hear fossil fuel interests say that the spill was caused by port delays. Well, after Deepwater Horizon, they blamed the spill on bad luck. Bad luck, look it up. After the 1969 oil spill off Santa Barbara, an oil executive publicly lamented the, quote, publicity for the loss of a few birds, end quote. But no matter the excuse, offshore drilling is the common denominator, because when they drill, they will spill. It can't be done without significant risk. So I know I'm out of time, but I want to thank both chairs for their continued leadership. There's a lot more we're going to have to do to get this problem under control, and I look forward to taking first steps here today. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin. Now I'd like to recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Jacobs, for her opening remarks.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chairwoman Porter, for inviting me to join today, and Chairman Lowenthal for helping to convene this hearing. While I don't sit on the Committee on Natural Resources, I do represent San Diego, and the issue of offshore drilling and these devastating oil spills affect all of us in coastal communities up and down the state. Environmental and wildlife protection are two of the top concerns I hear from my constituents, and so many have reached out to express their concerns about the October 2nd oil spill, what it means for the health of our community, our environment, and our businesses. If the ocean's currents had been even a little bit stronger, this spill could have traveled all the way down to our San Diego communities, potentially affecting our entire southern coast, and we're still concerned about the possibility of continued impacts. I'm thankful the state of California put a stop to offshore drilling off our coast, but as my colleagues mentioned, there are still 200 miles of established pipelines, all of them decades old. We've known for a long time that these pipelines pose risks to our marine life and our ocean-dependent businesses, and I agree we need to focus on decommissioning them as soon as possible. And I'm so grateful that in the meantime, Chairs Porter and Lowenthal are leading the efforts to make sure Congress is fulfilling our responsibility to prevent these spills from happening again and holding accountable those who cause them and harm our communities. And this hearing today is an important place to start. It's simply unacceptable that, as the United States Coast Guard has reported, this pipeline may have been damaged as early as January of this year, and as Congressman Levin said, was not reported. In fact, the last recorded inspection happened a full year ago, meaning this spill may have been going on much longer than we realized, and these infrequent inspections combined with more extreme weather events and our aging infrastructure are a recipe for disaster. And our coastline, our wildlife, and our small businesses are paying the price. As the youngest member of Congress from California, I'm keenly aware that my generation and future generations are going to be the ones living with the consequences of these environmental disasters and the decisions Congress makes about them longer than anyone else. So that's why I'm so grateful to be here today. I'm so grateful to our witnesses, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you about the ways this spill has affected your lives and livelihoods, and what we here in Congress can do better to support you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jacobs. Now I would like to turn to our witness panel. Before introducing them, I will remind witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation for further information. I want to remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire testimony statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer in front of you will start. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time has expired. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair is now pleased to recognize Dr. Michael Zicardi, Director of the Oiled Wildlife Care Network and Executive Director of the One Health Institute at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. Thank you for joining us today. You may begin.
Well, thank you very much, honorable chairs, members of the committee, and members of Congress. I'm honored to be here to give testimony on this. It is on. Can you hear? Okay. So I'm also the current wildlife branch director for the incident, so I'm actively involved in the spill. Before I get into the specifics of our response, I'd like to provide a brief background on our program. In 1990, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Office of Spill Prevention and Response was formed with the charge of ensuring best achievable protection of coastal and marine resources. The OSPR was also charged with establishing rescue and rehabilitation centers for sea otters, seabirds, and other marine mammals, ensuring that these facilities are in a constant state of preparedness, providing best achievable treatment for wildlife oiled in the marine environment, and considering all feasible management alternatives for operations of the network. These priorities were established to address different needs identified both during the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska, as well as the 1990 American Trader incident right here in Huntington Beach. These additional priorities included developing substantial readiness for wildlife efforts prior to a spill occurring, to standardize the care and response structure throughout the state, no matter where a spill might occur, to bring all interested parties into the readiness and response structure, and to base care decisions on the best available science. In 1994, the OWCN, Oiled Wildlife Care Network, was established directly by an OSPR administrator to implement these provisions, with the operation shifting to UC Davis in 1997. Our mission is to provide the best achievable capture and care of oil-affected wildlife anywhere in the state. The structure of the OWCN was and is based on a successful business plan, more a business model than a standard university structure. Our current structure includes 44 member organizations throughout the state that agree to work cooperatively and under a single management structure during a spill, construction of 12 primary care facilities throughout the state. We've effectively responded to more than 80 spills and cared for over 10,000 animals during spills in the state. We've trained more than 2,500 individuals to respond immediately to spills anywhere, and we've allocated more than $4.5 million in research in over 200 projects to look how to better respond to spills. Now, the effects of oil on wildlife are multifactorial, and because of time limitations, I'm only going to be focusing on birds for this response. In birds, the primary issue we are concerned mostly about are the acute effects due to hypothermia. If you think of feathers almost as a dry suit in animals, if oil gets on that dry suit, it creates a hole that allows cold water to seep next to the skin. Birds can get very cold in the environment, start to waste away. They have to come ashore to stay warm, but they can no longer eat. So these birds actually can waste away in a matter of days unless proactive capture occurs. There can also be chronic effects in animals as well, due to preening of oil off of the feathers or ingestion in their food items. Those chronic effects can include, in essence, effects on every organ system in an animal's body, from reproductive effects, liver, kidney, respiratory tracts, depending on the dose and the exposure and the toxin itself. There's a very extensive process that we follow for oil spill response. It is in the written testimony. What I'm going to do now is focus on what we're doing to date. For the current spill, the OWCN was activated on Saturday, 2nd of October. We had individuals en route by 4 a.m. the next morning to immediately start to cover the beach to collect any and all animals that might have been affected. We put 4 of our facilities on standby and immediately started responding. To date, as of last night, we've collected 32 live oiled birds, 67 dead birds, 5 mammals, and 14 fish throughout the region. Each of the live birds was collected oiled, but only a subset of dead birds and the other species have been found to be externally oiled to date. We have successfully released 10 of the most heavily oiled birds back into a clean environment, expect to release an additional 6 birds this Wednesday, and continue to release animals when they have returned to normal. We will continue recovery operations until all of the moderate to heavily coated animals observed by our teams or reported by the public are captured, and continue rehabilitation efforts until the last animal is released. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Mr. Breneman for his testimony.
Hello, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to tell my story. Born and raised in Newport Beach, business owner. I own multiple commercial and state, or federal and state commercial fishing permits. Based out of Newport Beach, I own a commercial fishing business, which I sell wholesale, restaurant, and retail. My fish market is located on the sand in the right next to the Newport Pier in Newport Beach. I also own a waterfront restaurant in Newport Beach based on local seafood. Going back to how this all started, we were fishing Friday, October 1st, and we were coming in the harbor, and I detected a distinct odor of oil, and it was about midnight when we were heading in. Kind of searched around the boat, thought maybe it was a spill on the boat or a hose broke. Went in the engine room, searched all the hatches where I keep all my extra fluids, everything. Didn't find anything. Come the next day, the press released that there was an actual oil spill, and my fish sales at my fish market, once that was released, they dropped drastically, down 90% this past few weeks since it was released. I've seen the same effect. My family's been fishing for 4 generations, and in the 90s, my dad went through the oil spill that was off Seal Beach in our fish market. The same exact response from the public. Scared, worried the product's contaminated, all the way up, the huge ripple effect, all the way up to the wholesalers I deal with outside of Orange County. They had concerns from their customers, their restaurants. And to rebuild that business, when it happened in the 90s, I watched my dad struggle for months to get it back to where it was. And I'm seeing the same exact thing happen here. A couple of days after the oil spill, they had closed the Newport Harbor. And so my boat was actually trapped inside of the harbor, so I wasn't even able to go service my accounts. And it's just been, to tell you the truth, a very difficult couple weeks, and I'm not sure how long this is going to last. I'm not sure how the public's going to respond to it long term, if they're still going to have some fear that the fish is contaminated. If you have any questions for me, feel free to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Breneman, for sharing your experience. We will have questions for you when we finish the witnesses, but I really want to thank you for sharing about your family's business and how this is affecting you personally. We'll now turn to, the chair will now recognize Mr. Desai, founding member of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Pacific Coast.
Good morning, Chair Porter, Chair Lowenthal, Representative Levin, and Representative Jacobs. My name is Vipe Desai, and I'm a founding member of the Business Alliance for Protecting the Pacific Coast, BAPAC. BAPAC is joined by business alliances on the East Coast and Gulf Coast that collectively represents the economic interests of more than 55,000 businesses. Together, we hope that Congress will understand that up and down America's coasts, our businesses rely on healthy oceans and clean beaches to keep our doors open. I greatly appreciate the opportunity to testify today representing some of the businesses who are feeling the economic consequences of the recent oil spill disaster here in Southern California. The recent oil spill confirms what we unfortunately know far too well. Offshore drilling is dirty and dangerous, and when they drill, they spill. In fact, between 2007 and 2018, there were over 7,000 oil spills in federal waters, an average of about 2 every day. These spills are extremely disruptive to our businesses, our lives, and our health. The impacts ripple across the economy and across sectors. I want to share the stories of some of the businesses that have been impacted. After 18 long months of facing the challenge from the pandemic, an oil spill was the last thing our vibrant economic region needed to face. The first impact came from the much-anticipated Pacific Air Show. As oil began to wash ashore, beaches were deemed unsafe for activity. On Saturday, October 2nd, 1.5 million visitors saw the show from Huntington Beach, but the show's triumphant conclusion on Sunday was canceled with little fanfare. Cancellations hit hotels and resorts almost immediately, and their surrounding and retail and restaurants suffered. Wing Lam, co-founder of Wahoo's Fish Tacos, informed me that the Saturday before the oil spill felt like a busy summer day, but the following day, once word got out about the spill, it was a ghost town. In addition, as the spill moved south, their locations in Laguna Beach and San Clemente started to feel the impacts. Bobby Abdel, owner of Jack Surfboards, had a similarly bleak weekend. He told me that once the oil spill was announced, customer traffic plummeted. Their stores are facing a stockpile of unsold inventory from the U.S. Open of Surfing and the Pacific Air Show. All 9 of Jack Surfboards locations were impacted in some form or another because of the spill. Later in the week, I received a call from a colleague, Wendy Marshall, a full-time, hard-working mother of two who shared with me that her upcoming Airbnb reservations, a form of income to help her offset college tuition costs for her children, had mostly been canceled. From Dana Point, the dolphin and whale capital of the world and the first whale heritage site in the Americas, Giselle Anderson from local business Captain Dave's Dolphin and Whale Watching Safari shared losses from trips and bookings into November could be down as much as 74% because of the oil spill. Another story came from members of our fishing community where a fishing company's boat was diverted to San Diego and the crews were Ubering from Newport to San Diego. Other tour operators were grounded and couldn't leave Newport Harbor. The gas dock saw large drops in fuel sales with no one heading to Catalina or out to cruise or fish. Grant Bixby, a local retailer, saw his clients' vacation rentals drop all the way into November. Their rental income is what they use to pay their mortgages and bills, critical to their overall financial picture. I could go on and on with the stories, but the message is clear. Where they drill, they spill, and when they spill, working-class people are stuck with the consequences. Businesses along the West Coast know that a clean and healthy ocean is what drives our vibrant coastal communities. Accordingly, Congress must ensure that the Build Back Better Act retains provisions to permanently protect the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, as well as the eastern Gulf of Mexico from any new federal oil and gas leasing. Permanently protecting our coast from new offshore drilling will prevent a repeat of mistakes from our past, support our transition to clean energy, and ultimately help safeguard our businesses, our jobs, and our economies from the next drilling disaster and ensure cleaner coasts and a healthier ocean for generations to come. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to support President Biden's Build Back Better plan for our environment, our economy, and our future. In closing, I want to take a moment to thank local, state, and federal leaders, agencies, and countless volunteers for their swift response to help with cleanup efforts. Early indications were that the oil spill could damage the local economy for weeks, if not months, were it not for the quick actions that were taken. Once again, I greatly appreciate the opportunity to testify today representing stories from our coastal community.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Dr. David Valentine, the Norris Presidential Chair of Earth Science and Professor of Marine Science at UC Santa Barbara. Mr. Valentine?
Good morning, Chair Porter, Chair Lowenthal, and Representatives Jacobs and Levin. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today about the pipeline P00547 incident, as it's called, the recent spill that originated offshore Orange County with impacts to the coastal region of Southern California. As you said, I'm a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, although I would point out that I have lived and worked in both San Diego and Orange counties. Among other topics in marine science, I research the behavior and fate of hydrocarbons and other pollutants in the environment. On this topic, I've written extensively, led numerous oceanographic expeditions, worked at major spills, and served the National Academy of Sciences as an expert on multiple study panels. I've also engaged directly in the spill planning and response process, including work with the Unified Command Structure and within the Natural Resource Damage Assessment. For the past 2 weeks, I have closely watched this spill unfold. I have engaged with scientists, members of the public, media, and conducted my own research on the spill. Looked into production at the Beta Field, local oceanographic conditions, and also spent a full day visiting the coastline of Orange County from Seal Beach to Laguna Beach. I want to invoke my privilege as a university professor to start with a little bit of a history lesson. Many people think that the largest spill in U.S. history occurred in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. This is not correct. The largest spill in U.S. history occurred in California. It was not the October 2021 spill that we're here to talk about today, nor was it the 2015 Refugio Beach pipeline rupture along the Gaviota coast. It was not the 2007 Costco Busan spill in San Francisco Bay, and it was not the 1997 Platform Irene pipeline rupture off Vandenberg Air Force Base. It was not the 1990 American Trader spill off the coast of Huntington Beach, and it was not the 1969 Platform A oil spill off of Santa Barbara, the one that helped spawn the environmental movement. Nor was it the sinking of the SS Montebello, an oil freighter that was hit by a Japanese torpedo off the coast of Cambria in World War II. It was called the Lakeview Gusher. It occurred in Kern County, and it's estimated to have released around 380 million gallons of oil over an 18-month period starting in 1910. And I tell you this bit of California history because it punctuates 5 important points. First, oil production carries inherent risk. Second, California has suffered more than its fair share of spills. Third, the size of a spill is only one factor in determining its impact. Fourth, responsiveness and context matter. And fifth, every spill is different, and that includes the impacts. I'd like to expand now on that fifth point about impacts from offshore spills. When I look at impacts, I take into account a range of factors that include quantity, location, properties of the discharge, circumstances of the release, transport to the coastline, weather and ocean conditions, locations of sensitive habitats, as well as the availability of infrastructure, resources, and personnel. In considering such impacts, I look for an offshore spill. I also think about the potential exposure to oil within the context of the chemical and physical changes to oil as it is exposed to the elements and transported by ocean processes. Because both acute and lingering impacts from oil stem from exposure, I like to consider when and how environmental compartments might be impacted. For the current spill, I have honed in on 3 key modes of exposure that concern me most: floating oil slicks that can impact organisms living at or near the sea surface, coastline areas such as wetlands where oil can accumulate and persist, and the seafloor where oil can easily hide from view but may still pose longer-term risks. Among these 3, the fate of impacts of submerged oil is especially relevant to California, is the least well understood, and requires additional research effort. In considering potential impacts such as these from a spill, it is also important to consider the formal legal process for assessing damages to natural resources. The point I want to make here is that under the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, a formal process does exist to determine the damages that occurred to natural resources, to compensate the public for the loss of those resources, and to return the injured resources to their original condition. However, it is also important to note that not all environmental impacts qualify as damages. A final point that I want to make is about preparedness. While it's important to assimilate lessons from previous spills, history has shown us that the next major spill may be very different, and our preparedness needs to allow for forward thinking. I can tell you examples from my own experience with Deepwater Horizon, the Refugio spill, deep ocean DDT dumping, but I think the point is well made by the case of the MV Express Pearl. Following a vessel fire off the coast of Sri Lanka earlier this year, the coastline was inundated with a combination of oil, nitric acid, and billions of scorched nurdles carried by this vessel. Nurdles, if you don't know, are tiny pellets of plastic used as raw material in the manufacture of plastic products. This event in particular makes me wonder what else is out there that might spill and with what unforeseen impacts. And with that, I stand ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that valuable testimony. Reminding the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions that they may wish to ask the witnesses. I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Desai, you work with many different local businesses, and do some of those businesses become temporarily unprofitable for reasons out of their control, like an oil leak?
Yes, Chair Porter. Businesses can become unprofitable. The difference is the size of the business and the number of locations. If you have a business that has multiple locations across the U.S., it is easier for them to absorb those losses. But what I'm talking about is the individual retailers, the mom and pop businesses. They suffer the most. The impact is immediate, and it has a ripple effect throughout the community. So it could take weeks, if not months, for these businesses to recover. And
many of these businesses, of course, are located along coast. So when we have a coastal problem, it affects, they have 6 chains, 6 stores, but they're all along the coast. Many businesses, though, have ups and downs, and sometimes when those downs are caused by something big, like an oil leak, these businesses can get help. In your opinion, would federal relief from the Small Business Administration, the SBA, help these businesses?
Absolutely. I think there are businesses out there that would welcome any sort of assistance from local, state, or federal agencies. But really, at the end of the day, what these businesses want, being a small business owner, hearing from so many, they just want to get back to business on their own. They want to contribute to the economy. The only help they want is from their customers to keep business. They don't want a handout or a hand up or anything, but in circumstances like this, any assistance is welcome.
Well, and I think that's consistent with what we heard from Mr. Breneman, what is that he wants to not have these interruptions to his successful businesses. He's built them to be successful, and he'd like to not have them interrupted. He'd like to be able to continue to have them. Sometimes when we have businesses that are harmed, we use taxpayer dollars to try to help them through these temporary problems. We saw this, for example, with airlines during COVID-19. We wanted to make sure we had an airline industry after that. We see this sometimes when we're trying to grow a newer industry, like solar with batteries. Mr. Desai, would you say the oil industry is a new industry?
I wouldn't say the oil industry is a new industry. It's been around for decades. But I think if I put on my hat of a business owner, I think responsibility lies in being able to pivot to where the future is headed. The future is clean energy. And this is an opportunity for some of these businesses that have been steeped in fossil fuels to look at expanding their offerings, especially moving towards clean energy.
Well, one thing I've been looking at is why, since the oil industry isn't one of the industries that's hurt by oil spills, for example. In fact, they cause oil leaks, and they're not a new industry. I've been looking into the generous relief that they get from the federal government. So recently I asked the Department of Interior about the specific kinds of subsidies that Beta Operating received. Beta is a subsidiary of Amplify Energy, and that's the company that owns the platforms and the pipelines that leaked off our coast. It turns out that they got nearly $20 million from the federal government specifically because the oil wells are at the end of their lives and are not producing much oil, which makes them less profitable. So taxpayers are being asked to pay to encourage oil production in the Pacific Ocean by giving oil companies millions of dollars to do it. Mr. Desai, would $20 million do a lot for small businesses along the coast who are suffering?
Oh, absolutely. $20 million would be a great investment in small businesses, and the ROI would have a ripple effect throughout the community.
Well, there's more on this federal relief point. Beta Operating is in line to get another $11 million to drill 4 new wells off the coast, because that $11 million is needed, in their words, to make production economic. So taxpayers are being asked to pay Beta to drill new wells. That means wells that would otherwise not be drilled without our taxpayer subsidy. So Beta is being paid $31 million by taxpayers over 5 years to pull oil out of this old, unprofitable oil field. And with that money, Beta tried to extract more oil, then it leaked, devastating Southern California businesses. The Build Back Better budget will end the royalty cuts program, which is the subsidy that Beta got. And that's just one more reason that we should all support it. I would now like to recognize Chair Lowenthal for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Porter. My first question is for Dr. Zicardi.
Proceed to the root.
Thank you for describing the impact of this spill, especially on the birds that have been recovered. But I'm interested in something that I read, and that was about the recovered dolphins also. I believe that there were a number that were recovered, and one had to be euthanized. I understand it isn't determined at this time if the oil spill was the cause of the death, but can you explain how dolphins and other marine mammals are harmed when they encounter a spill?
I'd be happy to. So yes, you're correct. One live northern right whale dolphin was stranded live, and unfortunately, due to poor condition, was humanely euthanized. And a full post-mortem examination was done on that animal with the findings to come. What we have found during and after the Deepwater Horizon oil spill is that dolphins can be significantly impacted by oil, primarily through inhalation of the fumes at the surface and ingestion of the oil substances themselves. What we found is that it affects their immune system, it affects their reproductive tract, and it affects their gastrointestinal tract, so very significant changes. And that's information that is just now starting to come out in the publications from the Deepwater Horizon incident.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Mr. Breneman, first of all, I don't really have a lot. I just want to follow up. That was very riveting, the impacts. And, you know, as a potential customer myself, I'm wondering, how do you convince me that it's safe? You know, because I worry myself now.
Yeah, it's our fishing grounds. We're fishing 90 miles off the coast, so we're a fair distance away from the contaminated waters. The public doesn't see it that way. They just assume local is a local term. It's coming basically right outside the surf line, which it's just public awareness. They're not aware that we're fishing 90 miles out, 3,000 feet down for some of the species we catch. Real clean, pristine waters, hardly any pollution. Zero mercury in the fish. We've done testing on all kinds of different samples with Fish and Wildlife, and people just don't know. They're not aware of it.
I hear you. I'm just saying it would take a lot to convince me. So I really appreciate what you're going through, and even though, you know, trying to explain to people how it is safe, because, you know, we worry about that.
I've had some accounts for over a decade now, and they're even asking me some questions about the contamination and the product, and, you know, the liability on selling it on their end.
Well, thank you. Mr. Desai, it's good to see you again. For those that are not aware, Mr. Desai traveled to Washington, D.C. in April of 2019 to testify on the need to protect coastal communities from offshore drilling. Mr. Desai, at that hearing, you explained the long history of oil disasters off California's coast, and you said another spill would have grave economic implications for local businesses in Southern California. How does it feel seeing the economic effects firsthand now? And are you surprised that another spill happened so quickly?
You know, I'm incredibly heartbroken and disappointed that another oil spill has occurred. But as many of us know far too well, it was a matter of when, not if, when there would be another one and how soon. It brings me no joy to have this conversation, but over my lifetime, we have seen oil spills occur. San Francisco, Santa Barbara, and Huntington Beach. There are patterns over the last 52 years. So we knew it was just a matter of time. And I think what concerned me most was how vibrant and rich of an economic zone we live in. And that is what concerned me, that an oil spill in this area would have grave economic consequences. I also want to share that, you know, look, the larger concern also is that had this oil spill moved north, it would have impacted two of the busiest ports in the nation, which account for billions of dollars of goods flowing in and out of both ports of LA and Long Beach. And that would have had an even larger impact to other communities across the U.S.
Thank you. I will come back to follow up on this, but I'm going to yield back. Thank you.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Porter. I wanted to make one big picture point before asking some questions about it, which is that I have had so many meetings where in public, town halls and all the rest, and I asked, does anybody here at this particular meeting support more drilling off the coast? And you would be amazed that I get virtually no hands. We were actually in San Diego. Somebody did raise their hand. We were at a press conference. Turned out that person had been visiting from Bakersfield and worked for the oil companies. So pretty much the only people I hear from that want more drilling off our coast are the oil executives in the fossil fuel industry and the politicians who are completely beholden to them. which I think leads to another important point. I hear the fossil fuel industry sometimes say that they need to drill off our state, but I think it's important we remember just how much they're actually drilling. It's a drop in the bucket when you consider that the annual oil production off the coast of California is about 1/3 of what our nation produces in a single day. So it really is a drop in the bucket when you consider the overwhelming potential for economic damage, for environmental damage. The risks simply aren't worth it. And I challenge anyone in the fossil fuel industry to explain that the economic and environmental risks in coastal Southern California in particular are worth it. With that, I want to turn to Mr. Desai. From what I understand, you were raised in California, you've lived your entire adult life in the state. And what I'm curious about is you see the coastal economy. You know more about the coastal economy than almost anybody. Do you see this coastal economy continuing to increase? In other words, have the number of businesses that are reliant on a healthy Pacific Ocean and a clean coast, are they increasing over the years?
Congressman Levin, absolutely. California's ocean economy has been prospering for decades. If it were a country, it would be the 5th largest in the world. California's ocean economy generates $54.3 billion in revenue and supports 654,000 jobs. California is leading the way by investing in the future. And I have seen this growing up in the area. The economy has grown, businesses have flourished, and if you look at it, it's because of our coastal regions that have drawn people and businesses, tourism, and visitors to the area.
Thank you for that. Supporters of offshore drilling, again, mostly fossil fuel executives and those from fossil fuel areas, they sometimes point to our use of oil and the fact that we drive cars and take airplanes as evidence for wanting to prevent fossil fuel development, or are being hypocritical for wanting to prevent fossil fuel development. How would you respond to the argument that they make, and how do you reconcile your opposition to offshore oil and gas with your lifestyle that requires the use of oil and gas?
Yeah, look, transitioning to clean energy is not going to be a simple task. Fossil fuels will be with us for a while, unfortunately. But the last thing anybody wants to do is damage our economy. But the data and science are clear. Fossil fuels are causing harm to our planet, and which will further harm our economy and our environment. Climate is changing, and I believe this is an opportunity for us to be proactive than to be reactive.
And on that same note, what are your thoughts on transitioning California from a state that produces offshore oil and gas to offshore wind energy? And do you think offshore wind energy could strengthen current local businesses rather than jeopardize their livelihoods?
100%. Clean energy and offshore wind energy would be welcomed by businesses throughout California.
Mr. Desai, my last question for now. It's my understanding that tomorrow night the Huntington Beach City Council will vote on an agenda item stating that the council is opposed to new offshore oil and gas drilling, fracking, and other well stimulation activities in federal and state waters off the California coast. Do you think there's value in local governments and community members voicing their support for protecting our coast from offshore drilling?
Absolutely. Huntington Beach knows better than most coastal cities how important our coastal regions are to businesses. There's a reason why Surf City, USA was named for Huntington Beach. They've earned that trademark. I welcome the resolution on tomorrow's agenda and want to point out that we have 2 council members here today, Council Members Natalie Moser and Dan Kalmick, and I appreciate their leadership in bringing this resolution before the City Council.
I thank the council members for being here as well, and have more questions, Chair Porter, but I will yield for now.
Thank you. Ms. Jacobs, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for questioning.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Zicardi, I first want to say how pleased I was to hear that you established a response site at SeaWorld in San Diego and conducted recovery efforts at South Carlsbad State Beach. As Rep. Levin mentioned, tar balls have been found on the beaches as far south as Del Mar. We're starting to see that oil slicks might be making their way south as well. And as I mentioned in my opening, my constituents and I care deeply about the wildlife in our communities. So I'm thankful for the hard work that you and the Oiled Wildlife Care Network have done this month in response to the spill. When my sibling went to UC Davis, they volunteered with your lab. So thank you very much. I wanted to ask both you and Dr. Valentine, as we're looking at these continued impacts, how far south do you anticipate the impacts moving, and what more could we be doing in San Diego to start preparing for that?
I can touch first, at least, on the impacts, acute impacts on wildlife. We have collected animals as far south as Oceanside. Indeed, our last live oiled bird we collected was collected by the public in Oceanside, transported to SeaWorld, and then back up to us. So we are seeing impacts throughout the region, continuing to have a hotline reporting animals and findings, and continuing to respond to those actively.
I can respond briefly to the how far down the coast the impacts might extend. It's a difficult question to answer. Right? We're trying to predict how the ocean is behaving, and we don't have all of the tools available to do that. We know that after the spill, or we think from satellite data, that there was offshore oil and a slick that was located toward the southern end of Catalina, but not close to Catalina. That broke up with the weather system, meaning that it turned into another form of oil, being more of a globular tarball kind of form. That may very well be what you've been seeing coming ashore already.
Of course.
We know in many instances that you can have very distant beach oiling events. During the Refugio spill, for example, up in Santa Barbara, oil from that event inundated Manhattan Beach and caused beach closures there, and that's quite some distance away. So that can happen, but we don't quite know what more will come ashore.
Thank you. And Dr. Valentine, I actually want to say with you, in your testimony, you said that the next spill will likely be different, and that means we'll need to prepare differently. What do you think we should be doing to prepare? And in particular, what aren't we thinking about when we're thinking about future oil spills?
I think that the response community does think about these things, and they meet regularly. There's quarterly meetings, for example, the EPA Region 9 Regional Response Team. Every 3 months, they're talking about these things. In part, it's the response community that needs to think about it. In part, I think we also need to be thinking scientifically about it and asking, what's on all of these vessels that might be spilling, and what might those impacts be? What should we know? But I think most importantly, having a baseline, knowing where we're starting in an environment is extremely important, because once a spill hits, we don't know necessarily what the effects were if we don't know exactly how that ecosystem was functioning to begin with.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Desai, it's kind of interesting timing that we're seeing this oil spill as we in Congress are debating massive investments in climate resiliency, and yet we're also hearing from some folks that they think these investments aren't necessary and aren't a priority. So I wanted to ask you, as we're talking about these repeated oil spills, as all of you have mentioned, this is likely not to be the last one we see. Of the things we're discussing in the Build Back Better Act as it relates to climate resiliency, what funding would you be willing to see cut that you think wouldn't be necessary right now?
Rep. Jacobs, it's a little bit outside of my understanding. There are a lot of details that I'm not completely aware of. I wish I could give you a better answer. What I would say is, moving towards investments in clean energy, climate risk mitigation would be good investments to look at.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We're going to now move to a second round of questions, and I'm going to start by recognizing Chair Lowenthal.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Porter. Dr. Zicardi, you have really indicated to us the nature and the criticalness of having a quick action wildlife response network for oil spills. That you've done. What I'm interested in, you've been working at this for a number of years, or through a number. Can you take us through how the response measures to rescue wildlife from oil spills have evolved over the last number of years?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Through the research that we've done, through the experience that we've had both here in California as well as participating internationally, what we really found is the rapid response, as you indicate, and the quick provision of first aid to animals really increases survivability. So getting them out of the field quickly, getting them warm, getting them hydrated, and then moving them to purpose-built facilities, absolutely essential. It's one of the reasons why in our system here in California, the Oil Wildlife Care Network is considered the world's model for oil wildlife preparedness and response, because we have that system in place ready to go 24 hours a day.
Thank you. Mr. Desai, according to ProPublica database, last year the company Amplify Energy received a $5.5 million Paycheck Protection Program loan from the federal government that was ultimately forgiven, including the interest. I just want to know what your thoughts are about providing taxpayer dollars to fossil fuel companies that have such an extensive record of safety violations.
As a taxpayer, I'm concerned with PPP loans going to companies violating the public trust and putting our environment at risk. I think penalties and regulatory scrutiny are better than taxpayer subsidies to actors like this.
So we have been subsidizing that company who has had its, or other companies, not just this one company, but we've heard about this history and the numbers of oil spills, and actually we're subsidizing them by giving them forgivable loans, is what you're saying. Dr. Valentine, almost immediately after the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster, we knew that the spill was going to be terrible for local economies along the Gulf of Mexico and, of course, for the marine environment and for the coastal ecosystems, too. But since the blowout, over the years, what more have we learned about the long-term negative environmental consequences of that disaster?
Yeah, the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster had innumerable consequences. The best documentation of that is a document called the Damage Assessment and Restoration Report that came from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It was a 1,000-page document. It had a chapter that was 685 pages that outlined the damages that occurred to ecosystems in the Gulf of Mexico. It was massive and pervasive. That was part of the NRDA process, the Natural Resource Damage Assessment, but there's been quite a bit of additional work that has been done. And in part, it's because in the settlement of that case, BP gave $750 million toward studying the Gulf of Mexico. And that led to a host of studies that have revealed a number of different longer-term impacts that people hadn't necessarily foreseen. The three areas that I would point out would be the sustained impacts in marsh environments, including impacts like coastal erosion that were triggered by oiling of marshes. Some of the larger fish species seem to have taken more of a hit than people might have predicted early on. But the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart is the deep sea coral. That the oil that sank to the seafloor, some of that inundated these deep sea coral communities, which are very rare, and caused significant damage to them. So that those efforts are largely twilighting now, that most of that $750 million has been spent, but it's given us new insight into that environment. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm going to have to leave now. I want to thank Chair Porter, my colleagues, the witnesses for their testimony. We've learned a lot from everybody here who are so interested in what Congress can do, and to listen to some of the impacts. I want to thank everyone for attending. It's been a very enlightening session so far, and I thank the chair.
Thank you. I'm now going to recognize myself for the second round of questioning. Dr. Valentine, in your testimony, you made two statements that I wanted to ask you to explain more to us, but also to the public who's here. The first one is you said, clean up does not equal recovery. Can you explain what you mean by that? Because we've heard a lot about how the cleanup has gone very well.
Yeah, the main point that I wanted to make is that the response, this entity that comes and takes care of oil spills, they have an end period when there is no more actionable oil, meaning that their actions can't clean up any more oil. And so that's what many of us think of as the cleanup phase. But they're a little bit like firefighters. The fire's out, you go back to your station, and that's how the response works. But impacts and recovery are an entirely different thing, because there are all sorts of things that are going on, both economically and environmentally, that are going to require additional time to heal. And that's the distinction I was trying to make.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And you got out really my second question, which was this phrase, actionable oil. We're told that all the actionable oil, they've identified it or they're working to identify it. And we talk about things like tar balls and oil that can be taken off wildlife, but that doesn't equal all the oil. Does Orange County have particular vulnerabilities or sensitivities to oil spills, and what are those?
I think that every environment has particular vulnerabilities and sensibility to oil spills. In Orange County, the areas that I would look at most closely as being especially vulnerable on the environmental side would be the wetland environments, places like Talbot Marsh, where oil can surge in with the tide, and it can get trapped in those environments, and it can get stuck, and it won't come back out when the tide recedes. Those are especially vulnerable because they're these rich, diverse ecosystems. They provide a whole host of different services, whether it's flyways or fisheries, or in keeping the nutrient levels moderated on the in the coastal waters. And that oil can stick there, and it can have a long-term impact. And furthermore, cleanup in those cases can be very difficult, because getting into a marsh and trying to clean it up manually can cause as much damage as the oil can cause. So those are very sensitive environments. I also, of course, am concerned about the floating oil and slicks, which I think we heard about some of the reasons why that can be dangerous, especially for birds. And then the other environment that I worry a lot about is the environment we can't see. That is what's going on under the surface of the ocean. And in that case, we can have oil that comes ashore and then gets pulled back offshore, but is now denser because it's accumulated sand and other mineral matter, and that can be sticking around in the coastal ocean. We don't really understand how much of that there is or exactly where it goes, and that concerns me.
Well, so I think one of the things we heard about was that there was a big storm, unusual here for Orange County. We had lightning and thunder, and a lot of that kept some of the oil slicks from moving closer. It held them a little bit off the coast for a while, but it also pushed some of it back out into the ocean, where we don't know where it goes in the open ocean. I have been studying a chart that I never wanted to look at, called the life cycle of a tar ball. So I just want to show everybody what a tar ball looks like. When these tar balls, when you find them, the people pick them up, and they add them to the amount of recovered oil. That's the actionable oil. But what happens when this goes out to sea?
Yeah, so when that goes out to sea, it has two options. If it's accumulated substantial amounts of sand or other minerals, it will actually go out to sea on the sea floor. And there it's going to move around a little bit, depending on how much mineral and what its actual density is, and eventually probably settle somewhere. If it's floating, then it's going to follow the currents and the winds. And it will get moved around and probably come ashore in this setting somewhere to the south of here.
So it could come ashore somewhere, say in Mexico, further south, somewhere where people are not looking for it, don't recognize it, don't know not to touch it.
Absolutely, and there is evidence. There was a 1,000-mile long spill in Brazil a couple of years ago, and there's evidence that that oil ended up in Florida.
Thank you very much, Dr. Valentine. Mr. Levin, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Chair Porter. I think it's very important to reinforce that taxpayers don't get stuck with the bill when it comes to the cleanup and when it comes to the decommissioning. We had a full Natural Resources Committee discussion the other day where one of my Republican colleagues acknowledged the sins of the past, his phrase, with regard to the cleanup of abandoned coal mines. I think it's important that we avoid the sins of the future when it comes to the cost of cleaning up some of our mess in the oil and gas sector. Dr. Valentine, I wanted to ask you, and I think we're going to have further discussions on the concept of these firms going bankrupt, Chair Porter. But Dr. Valentine, how concerned do you think Californians should be that companies that own the offshore platforms, wells, and pipelines might go bankrupt and pass decommissioning costs on to taxpayers?
I think that we need to be very concerned. And this is not just a hypothetical. This is already happening. There are 2 instances that I can tell you about that I've been involved with personally. The first stems from the Pipeline 901 rupture, also known as the Refugio Beach oil spill that happened in 2015. When that pipeline ruptured, it prevented oil from being further produced from Platform Holly off the coast of Santa Barbara, just a few miles from my home. That platform, when it was completely shut in, all 30 wells, was unable to produce any oil, and the company, a small operator, went bankrupt, and then shortly thereafter they went bankrupt again, and this time they just gave up. And they did something called quit claiming their lease back to the state of California, meaning that the plug and abandonment and property commissioning fell into the lap of the state of California in that case. And that is an ongoing saga. The second example I would give you is in Summerland. In 1896, the first offshore oil wells in this country were drilled from piers in Summerland. Those have been leaking over the years, and as recently as last year, there were 3 leaky oil wells coming up in Summerland. The state of California has found money to try alternative plug and abandonment strategies because anything traditional is not going to work on something that is 125 some odd years old. That would be the second example where this is now falling into the taxpayer's lap yet again.
We're going to do everything we can to prevent the taxpayers from getting stuck with this bill. With the time I have left, I just wanted to ask each of you, maybe take 15, 30 seconds. What is this oil spill in particular and the ongoing spills that we've seen again and again and again? What has it meant to you personally, professionally? Dr. Zicardi, I'll start with you.
I think personally and professionally, it really emphasizes the need for advanced preparedness. Until we do move to a 100% clean economy, petroleum is going to be used and it's going to be transported in some ways. So the importance of responding to these emergencies quickly, effectively, to reduce the damage to the natural environment, it's absolutely crucial.
Thank you. Mr. Breneman.
What the oil spill means to me, it brought me to the realization that something out of your control can completely control your life and how you live, what you do, financially, personally, across the board. So.
Thank you. Mr. Desai.
I've seen just how disruptive an oil spill can be to the environment and to the economy so swift and quickly, and how broad it can be affecting businesses of all sizes, shapes, and sectors.
Thank you. Dr. Valentine.
When I went on to pursue a PhD, I never thought I would be studying oil spills. But having worked at a number of them, what it's meant to me is a realization that we need and can bring the most modern science to understand what's happening in these situations and to inform both the cleanup and the recovery efforts.
Well, I want to thank you and Dr. Zicardi for your hard work on the cleanup. I want to thank also Mr. Breneman and Mr. Desai for your testimony. I'll continue to maintain that the only foolproof way that we prevent another one of these spills is to stop drilling. It's to stop all new drilling and to decommission the 23 platforms that are out there. I'll keep fighting until we collectively come to the realization that we've got to get that done. So, Chair Porter, I thank you for highlighting some of the concerns of the community today, and I'll yield back.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Representative Jacobs for a second round.
Thank you. Dr. Valentine, I just have one more question for you. While we've been trying to figure out the best way to respond and prevent future spills, some of our colleagues are actually working to ban cargo ships in the area as they believe that's where the issue lies. You've mentioned how many spills you've been involved in, and I was just wondering if you think that banning cargo ships will alleviate the problem and if there are other additional vulnerabilities that you see as potentially a greater concern than cargo ships.
Yeah, I think it's not specifically cargo ships that worry me most. What worries me is atypical conditions. Now, I'm an oceanographer. I work on the water all the time. And when things go as planned, they go as planned. But when the conditions change and you're not prepared for it, that's when things happen. And that may be the case here. So I think that I don't have an opinion about cargo ships. I'm not a politician. I'm a scientist. But I think that we do have to pay very careful attention to the potential that these cargo ships and industry in general brings to the coastal environment, and use policies that are going to help us to prevent incidents like this from occurring. And I don't have the answers for it, but that's what I hope we can do.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I have one more set of questions. Dr. Zicardi, the threatened snowy plover, it's a bird, was basically gone from this area for about 50 years until a nest showed up on the beach in 2017. Do you know how many snowy plover nests were counted in 2019?
I do not offhand. Apologize.
The answer is 19, which I can imagine is due to the dedication and the hard work and the funding devoted to recovering this species. Dr. Zicardi, in your work with the Oil Wildlife Care Network on this particular spill, how many snowy plovers did you capture or treat?
So we've collected 7 snowy plovers to date.
Okay. So this is a picture of Dr. Zicardi?
A western grebe, or a Clark's grebe, I apologize.
Okay, so this is one of the example of a bird that you were treating. We talked about those 7 snowy plovers. You may not know the exact numbers, but in your opinion, do you think that 7 harmed snowy plovers is a significant percentage of the population in our area when there are only 19 nests?
I definitely do. There is a reason why snowy plovers are federally threatened and state listed as a species of special concern, specifically in this area because of a restoration project that has been a success to date.
So we've spent money and time trying to restore this species only to have a pretty significant setback due to the animals that were harmed by the oil spill. Now, you said you have captured and treated 7. How many of those snowy plovers survived, and what's their prognosis?
So all 7 have survived. We've successfully released 4, and we're hoping to release the additional 3 this coming Wednesday.
And after you care for them and you do release them, what happens? Are they in the clear? I know you don't release them until you absolutely have done everything that you can, but is there a chance that they'll experience any lingering effects, could get back into oil again, could get in contact with a tarball or some other breakdown in oil product?
So they're as healthy as we can make them in our care. The best thing for them is to return them back to a clean environment. There is the chance of long-term effects from their oiling if they preened it, if they have internal injuries. There is a chance of ingestion of food items that may have been oiled out there. We have not released them back into an oiled environment, but it doesn't mean that oil didn't affect their food items. I think at this point we are following up. We have color banded each of those birds, and through state parks, San Diego Wildlife Alliance, other organizations that are doing follow-up studies, we're going to track them as closely as possible to look at success.
And besides the snowy plover, are there any other federal or state endangered species whose range overlaps with the oil slick or that you've treated?
So there are other federally threatened or endangered species who are in this area, none that we have treated to date. There are least terns in this area at different times. There are Savannah sparrows, there are California ridge rails, California gnatcatcher, other bird species, primarily in a lot of the marsh habitats that Dr. Valentine was referencing.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. I also want to thank the staff of the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee where I serve, and my staff for their hard work, including over multiple weekends and late nights. Many are in the room with us today. Many others are in DC making this field hearing possible. So I know that the other members present and Mr. Lowenthal and the other members of the committee thank the staff for their hard work. If there is no further business, then without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.